All right, I think we can get started. Thank you for being here on a Sunday morning. I know at one point the Academy considered Sundays days off, and over time, kind of content has creeped into everything. Perhaps it's sort of one of those conferences that last forever. At the same time, it is still a Sunday, and we should have kind of casual conversations on Sunday at the very least. So what we have planned for you today on the topic of business and management in the age of rising nationalism, historical perspectives, is a symposium discussion. We're not going to sort of kind of belabor kind of the session with presentations and so forth, but really to engage in a set of questions and answers, first with the panelists and then with all of you. The context here is not surprising, right? We are in some ways caught in this age, or at least this moment, of rising nationalism. And there's a lot of evidence that we are seeing nationalist movements develop in many countries around the world, not just the Anglo-American world, nor just the European world. And there is evidence, actually hard evidence, that we have these rising right-wing nationalist movements, but also in many parts of the developing world. And in some ways, it's a moment that's caught a lot of the academic community off guard, in part because it challenges many of the assumptions of both the context within which business and management has been operating in the last 20 or 30 years, and in some ways has kind of questioned also the broader narratives of progress and globalization that tended to pervade much of our discourse in management. And yet, I think history offers a perspective that is useful for grasping this moment that seems at times in some ways ungraspable or difficult to get a hold of, in part because it provides a perspective that reminds us that nationalism is not new, and that nationalism, sort of economic nationalism, in some ways has been around for a while. Just take, for example, the intra-war period of the period between the two world wars, and the fact that in many ways it represented a period of rising nationalism in reaction to an earlier wave of globalization. John Maynard Keynes, writing in 1920, looked back just 6 years earlier upon the world of 1914 and wrote this about it: "What an extraordinary episode in the economic progress of man that age was, which came to an end in August 1914. The inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. He could secure forthwith, if he wished, cheap and comfortable means of transit to any country or climate without passport or other formality. But most important of all, he regarded the state of affairs as normal and permanent, except in the direction of further improvement, and any deviation from it was aberrant, scandalous, and avoidable." These sort of words in some ways sort of reflect back on maybe even how we thought about the global economy and about nationalism 5 or 10 years ago, and so kind of gives us a perspective that history can provide, and history can do a couple of things. I'm going to ask the panelists to get started, in fact, with what history can provide us, but it does suggest that it provides us some perspective on the current situation, not only because it gives us an analytical lens, but also it helps us critique and think about the ways in which history is being used by the actors and politicians that we itself encounter. The speakers for today, I'm Dan Wadhwani, by the way. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship at University of the Pacific and a business historian by background. I'll be moderating the panel and asking sort of questions to Matthias Kipping, who is chair in strategy and business history at the Schillig School of Business, Stephanie Decker, who is professor of org studies and history at Aston Business School, and Takafumi Kurosawa, who is professor of economics and economic history at University of Kyoto. So let me start with the question for the panel and with Matthias, and I know he's got a Star Wars-like quote to begin with. Why history? I'm going to just flip to that for you to begin.
Yeah, why history? I mean, I think you already pointed that out with your first quote by Keynes. This isn't new. History does not repeat itself in identical terms, but history consists of trends that actually do coexist, that do involve in evolutionary patterns. And one of those in the big picture is a tension between globalization and nationalism. And that tension came to a head in the First World War very dramatically. But it preceded, the First World War preceded by what some people call the first global economy. However, it was far from being the first global economy, and we talk about today as the second global economy, which is now under threat from a rising nationalism again. This quote is actually about something that's even historians are not sure it actually happened because there's only one single source for it. It's called the Guangzhou Massacre of the 9th century, and that is portrays the tension of again globalization, because the blame was put again on foreigners for economic decline, and the foreigners in that case were actually mainly Arab merchants who went to Canton to trade a lot of the Chinese goods with Europe. And the interesting story of that quote is it's actually from a novel which is written by an Indian, Amitav Ghosh. Some of you might know the Ibis trilogy, and this is the second book called The River of Smoke, and he lets somebody speak looking over Canton, Guangzhou, in the 19th century in the second volume of that called The River of Smoke, which is another episode of globalization when Britain opens up the world for global trade and imposes actually globalization on China, which then had, again in the 20th century, a big backlash, a nationalist backlash in China. And I'll come back to this because actually today China is one of the forces of globalization, whereas other countries are retreating. China is, if you think about the One Belt, One Road program and the speech the president gave at Davos, China is one of the countries that now promotes globalization. So we always have these tension, and that they go back thousands of years. And that's why history is very important to understand what's going on between nationalism and globalization.
Just because we have a mixed audience, could you just sort of explain when you say the first global economy, what are you referring to there?
Well, that's what historians call the first global economy, which is the 19th century. But again, it was an economy dominated by the British Empire, and it was a very imperialistic, colonial global economy. And China was one of the victims of British opening. And this whole book is called A River of Smoke because it's about opium. It's the British imposed opium on China because as an exchange for all the Chinese goods that people were trying to, the tea that Keynes talks about, came from China, and the British didn't want to pay in silver, which was the currency at the time, the global currency. So they said, well, we give them the opium, and you make people addicted, and that's a good business. They want more of it, and then the Chinese refused. And that led to the first Opium War, which then led to Hong Kong and the treaty ports and so on, and what the Chinese call a century of shame, against which Mao is a rebellion of a nationalist movement. So it's you have these tensions, and again, one important point to make here is they're not just Western. We often write history from a Western perspective, and you look at China, which is actually in the long-term history much more important in globalization than the US or Britain, which is the last 200 years. If you look at history in 1,000-year terms, China is actually the pivot of globalization. We're going back to China probably being the pivot of globalization in the next 50 years or so, my prediction. Historians shouldn't predict. Ask me in 50 years and I'll tell you.
Stephanie, could
I think to take a different angle on the relationship between economic nationalism and history, I think it's important to see that if you look at debates such as how Trump has been positioning himself in the US, as well as the Brexit debate in particular in the UK, it's really very much focused on using the past. So Brexit has in many ways been interpreted as a form of really imperial nostalgia. So Matthias was just talking about how imperialism was a form of globalization, But in the political imagination in the UK right now, imperialism is really a time period of nationalism, when you had imperial preference and you had a sort of safe space for Britain in the world. And I find this aspect where political organizations really blunder the past and actually use history to justify their nationalism an equally interesting subject where historians can really contribute to what we understand is happening in politics right now. The Guardian, for example, has, in a series of articles, commented on this, and they actually call the three ministers who were in charge of Brexit the three Brexiteers. So there's all sorts of fictional and historical analogy being used, and the inspiration for a lot of their policies seems to hark back to the 19th century, but in a very different way from how Matthias just traced the 19th century. And I think that's an important aspect, that when you use the past and you use history, you don't necessarily focus on fact or analysis. You use it in a way that really appeals to people, rather than in ways that we necessarily as historians would think is analytically a reasonable way of thinking about the past. And Trump, of course, making America great again. I mean, that is the vaguest possible use of history. What is the again? What is he referring to? We have vague ideas about protectionism that goes very far back in America's history, almost before America really became great. It was quite a protectionist power. So there's other elements which seem to be more about the male-dominated economy, old industries, industrialization. So it's a very vague notion. It's really more nostalgia than actual history. But I think its political potency is the element where historians really need to contribute to the debate, because it's interesting that the very uncritical use of history gains so much political traction. Could you swap? And one of the characters that suddenly appeared, for example, in the UK on the political scene is a historical character, which is Joseph Chamberlain, who's now been called the new lodestar of the imperial political landscape. So back in the day, he was in favor of higher tariffs and imperial preference, all of which sounds a little bit like, why would anybody care about this now, 100 years later? But obviously, the kind of policies he promoted are policies that now are seen as potential models for Britain's exit from the European Union. And the picture there at the bottom, this is Highbury, his home. I walk my dog there every morning. And honestly, until this year, I had only the vaguest of notions of which Chamberlain actually built that house, and because they're a bit of a political dynasty. And in Birmingham, the memory of Chamberlain was really about what he did for the city. So he was a Birmingham politician. And just this year, he's become more of a national historical legacy. And it's very interesting how characters are suddenly resurrected from the past for reasons that are really just aspects of their career. And it's this kind of linking of the current situation to the empire and to a time period where Britain was a great power, which arguably none of us really thinks Brexit's going to lead to a resurgence of Britain. I think it's a very specific part of the political landscape where they think that Brexit could really lead to a rise again of Britain as a great power in international politics. So I find these kind of very uncritical uses of history extremely interesting, and I think it's a good reason to go back and consider the role of history in economic nationalism, because realistically politicians have always used it to justify their policies in economically nationalist terms, but whether that was always logical or indeed correct, I think is a big question that is not always asked.
Takafumi, would you like to expand upon that same question about why history matters to understanding nationalism?
Okay. I'm originally an economic historian, so I love to talk big. Today I confine my discussion to
Pull the mic closer.
which is closely related to management or the behavior of companies. For me, I think that we can find a variety of organizational forms and strategies in response to economic nationalism and the political threats, and also opportunities it creates. And if we look at such a relationship, then we can position variety of organizational decisions in wider context. And history helps that kind of contextualization. For example, current organizational forms of multinationals, especially European ones, often originated and persisted from organizational responses to previous waves of nationalism. For example, European forums tend to have more decentralized organization than US ones, and it was actually the result of their effort to manage nationalism and confrontation and occupation, boycotting and sanctions and such elements. So, and in addition, I think it suggests that multinational enterprise theory, traditionally theories limited scope, because traditionally the theory assumed that international openness as a baseline condition and political nationalism as the exception. But history shows that openness and peace are relatively rare. That's the underlying assumption about multinational enterprise political context are misleading. We need to grapple with the fact that multinational enterprise has long dealt with political nationalism in their organization and strategies.
Great, thanks. So in some ways, let's sort of return to, in particular, this issue of these waves of globalization that we've kind of experienced. Traditionally, as Matthias was pointing out, many business historians would point to a first wave of globalization in the 19th century and a more recent one that emerged out of the post-World War II context and really sped up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But in fact, looking back further, you can see actually quite a number of periods of integration and disintegration of global connections and nationalist economic reaction. So maybe, Stephanie, if you could start us off by sort of helping us think through why do we see these kinds of sort of waves? What are some of the explanations that historians and other social scientists sort of present for both kind of global integration and disintegration in historical perspective?
I think historians are probably famous for always saying that there's more than one reason for any potential phenomena, that we always have multi-causal explanations. But if I had to simplify it down and say, well, there is the one main factor that really drives these shifts between internationalism and nationalism, I would say it has to do with whether countries, the great powers, the superpowers, fear a loss of control or feel that they're in control. So I think it's the sense of, is the world a place where they can act reasonably comfortably or feel that they might be losing control? And to me, that is the one major factor that seems to change over time whether a country is in support of internationalism or rather a more nationalist approach to international politics. And I think some of the examples from Matthias bear this out quite well. So Britain was very much in favor of an international order when Britain was a leading economic power. The same is true for the United States. When the United States was economically dominant, you see the United States has also been very much a carrier of international institutions. And now the shift to China as the great power that is really in favor of international solutions comes also with the economic rise of China. So I think the economics as well as the politics are very closely tied in these moves, and it's important to look at who is supporting which particular solution to international problems.
Matthias or Takafumi, who wants to go first in reaction?
Yeah, I mean, following on from this, I think it's important to realize that whatever it is, nationalism or internationalism or globalization always produces winners and losers, and they're not distributed equally. It's not that there's a single country losing or another country is winning. It's within countries that you have winners and losers. And at the moment we talk a lot about, because those are the people who shout the loudest, about a certain group of people losing in the Western developed world, and that's exploited by politicians based on sometimes, this artificially historically grounded discourses and the uses of history. But it's very clear that there are winners and losers. So today in the world there are actually big groups of winners. People have benefited from globalization. You go through Africa, you go through Asia. It's tremendous. I mean, if you look at the statistics, and that you have that historically as well. You have winners and losers, and then how are the losers mobilized to go back against globalization? That's one of the drivers. The other driver, and Stephanie already mentioned that, is global power. and it's not just economic power, political will, it's military power. Because somebody has to be willing to enforce globalization and actually, like Britain imposed, openness on China in the 19th century, and the US imposed for most of the 20th century openness on other countries because it benefited the US, or it was felt to benefit the US. And very important, and we don't talk about that, the backbone of any globalization, be it in the 10th century or today, is shipping. Without shipping, we would not get any movement of goods at a price that makes them affordable elsewhere. And somebody has to protect the shipping routes. And the one thing that China is missing, but they're working on it, is a powerful navy. And that was the British Navy, was in the 19th century. And then again, those Arabs that were killed in Canton, they were running the shipping routes. They were part of the Silk Route was actually shipping along the coastlines from China to Europe. And so that's and China is building aircraft carriers, so it'll just be a question of time until they have that power. But somebody needs to be willing to do that and enforce the rules, battle the pirates, which is another constant across history. Shipping and pirates come always together, and so history doesn't repeat itself, but there's patterns there, and technology changes, but the basic patterns don't change, and you have to have a hegemonic power and the willingness to use that power to protect globalization. And as I say, the US is increasingly less willing to use it, but China is increasingly more willing to use it. And so we're seeing a big shift, but these shifts have occurred over history again and again.
If I connect my argument with Matthias' comment on losers and winners, it is obvious that after the Second World War, for about 2 or 3 decades, that the gap between rich and poor, or losers and winners, shrunk, at least in the developed countries. However, in these decades, the trend changed, and now people are discussing tax evasion or Panama paper and so on. And so I think it is quite important to understand that international community have been using such loopholes like tax havens or neutral countries, because it was needed to create institutions and practices that got around the national rules or rules of nation states in order to operate and to maintain the global market. So neutral countries, tax evasions, and or distinct rule of international competition are the good example of such mechanism between a state system and economic activities go beyond the national boundaries. And actually, the nation states, including hegemons and other major states, permitted these international such exception to their power and control, because they understood such loopholes would facilitate prosperity and stability. And in addition, a rivalry among states. So we often talk about government and business, but governments are plural existence, and rivalry among nation states makes, for example, the downward movement to the bottom, for example, the competition to reduce corporate tax more intense. So I would say it is ironical, but such loophole, which was essential for the globalization, made the tension between poor and rich intensive, and eventually resulted in this today's resurgence of nationalism and or new trend toward the deglobalization. It is my feeling.
So let me ask actually a follow-up question to this one, the one that's been raised, in part because what I'm hearing in some ways in terms of the rationale for the disintegration of global economies comes in part from issues of power and ability to hold on to the power it takes to sort of keep the national order in play. But the issues that lead to disintegration that you're pointing to have in some ways the tinge of a moral economic argument, right? It's just the justifications, the tenets for the justification of the hegemonic power that's mentioned by Matthias and Stephanie, or in Takafumi's case, the hegemonic institutions that have been accepted, tax havens, special rules for competition, get undermined in terms of their moral justification. Is that am I pushing you too far? Is there really a moral economic foundation for the sustainability of the global economy, or is that really is it more of a kind of a political argument? Those who have the power will make the justice?
I don't know.
Well, I think one of the frameworks that might help to understand this, and maybe not so much from a moral aspect, but really from a question of what is legitimate. I think if we see the various debates around globalization from the 90s to the 2000s, there's this argument that these multinationals are now becoming more powerful than states. And obviously, as citizens of those states, none of us perhaps are entirely comfortable with that. And I think that is something that is a way to undermine the international institutions. If citizens feel they no longer deliver the kind of values they seek from their country, and they feel it's the business, the economics that actually undermine that, I think that again legitimates economic nationalism. Again, I think that goes back to this sense of loss of control.
Okay.
I don't think it's moral. I think this is business, and
Okay.
we talk about this in political terms,
Sure.
in public relations terms, and how you sell stuff, how you
Okay.
package stuff. It is really business. I mean, why did Britain intervene with the Opium Wars? Well, because it was lobbied by the opium traders, and they used the discourse of free trade to justify that. But you go around the world and you do some research and you see how business and Takafumi. I mean, these tax havens, a lot of that is driven by business. And again, but business there's the same as with people. It's winners and losers. And so some business will lobby for more opening, and other business will lobby for more closing. And you look through the U.S. or the developed economies, and if you look at the tech firms, they want immigration because they need the skills that you can find around the world, and others will say no, we want to close because we're threatened by foreign competition. So there's a whole layer. I mean, we talk a lot about the population and politics, but there's a whole layer of business underneath, and business is very, very active. If you go back to Europe, and I don't know whether you want to go to my quote, the start of Europe, while a politician made the first declaration, the start of European integration was the Schuman Plan. And it was the French Foreign Minister Schuman who made a declaration. My actual original PhD research showed that most of even the text was, ripped from letters that business people had written to the French government saying, we want more opening, and whereas there were other people lobbying for more closing, and at the same time, and the winners were the people who were more in favor of opening, and I try to trace how that debate actually shook out. So it is underneath. It's for me, it's business and economics.
Leading it.
Right.
And
Driving it. And,
so
and actually actively driving
okay.
it.
And that these moral economic arguments sit on top of
sit
that.
on top of
Okay.
it.
So
It
that's
sounds a bit Marxist here. I know it's
no,
the
but this
superstructure,
is a good point. Maybe
but,
when we open it up to the audience to
yeah,
debate
but that's what
but since you raised the kind of role of business, we've been talking at a very high level so far. So maybe let's sort of get into kind of how these might shape how we think about the role of business in reacting to economic nationalism and creating global economic integration. And maybe I can ask Takafumi to get started on this. How does sort of kind of taking into account these sort of waves of economic nationalism matter to how we study business, and particularly perhaps multinational enterprise?
Just one word to add.
Sure,
But
please,
yeah,
respond to him.
yeah,
Tell
yeah.
him he's wrong.
I also think it's business and economics rather than moral issues. But anyway, if I go back to the previous statement on, for example, loophole in international business or international economy, for example, most of the tax havens had its origin in early 20th century or interwar period, but those locations worked not only to evade, to hide your taxes, money from the taxation, but it also worked as a kind of safe haven for example, for the people who were persecuted by Nazis, for example. So the morale issue is not so simple. So you can use those loopholes for some wrongly motivated self-interest, but such loophole can work as a kind of infrastructure to cope with some threat to the moral issues. This is one thing, but I can provide an example to
Sure, your
to
slide?
exemplify
Yep.
such thing. Yeah, could you? Thank you. Yeah, this is just one example, but my explanation is based on the case of some international multinational firms from Europe, like Formula Roche, Swiss company, pharmaceutical giant, or Nestle, or Royal Dutch Shell, or Unilever. This is a case from
Might need to speak up a little bit, just because you're away from the
Yeah.
mic. Yeah.
case. This is story about those companies from interwar period or the Second World War. They had headquarters, main location in Europe. Then, after the First World War, they faced the collapse of the many empires in Eastern Europe, and their previous market in the region became a kind of patchwork, nation state, and so they had to cope with such change of the political condition. So they set up many subsidiaries in the region, and they needed some center to control those subsidiaries. So in case of these companies, some of the Swiss companies, they set up a holding company in Liechtenstein, in this case, to make its body to own the subsidiaries, especially to avoid double taxation on those companies' subsidiaries in the region, and double taxation on the headquarters. So initially it was a scheme to avoid double taxation. But then during the interwar period, or especially the political condition 1930s or later 1930s, those companies decided to invest more in the United States, considering European continent had high political risk, and the United States had great market chances. So they set up new headquarters, large headquarters in New York or suburban, some surrounding cities. And then war broke up, and subsidiary, this holding company on the European continent faced a strong threat of the confiscation or occupation and so on. So they relocated those holding company to the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, in Panama or Caribbean islands, or Dutch West Indies. And then, even during the Second World War, when the market was divided to war camps, communication was disrupted, and they had to separate it to asset to access area or allies area, but they continued their business by maintaining some level of communication with each other, but officially separating their asset and so on. This was a typical response of those multinationals when those companies faced total war or division of globalized market. And actually, some of those companies, like Nestle or Formula Roche, kept this type of scheme until through mid-1980s, when Cold War eventually ended. It was consideration against on the possible outbreak of the Second World War, or the risk Cold War turned to hot war. And at the same time, of course, this scheme was quite useful to reduce their tax burdens. So the scheme to cope with political risk was at the same time to cope with the taxation of nation state. But anyway, they maintained this type of organization until 1980s. Means they didn't adopt it more centralized corporate forms or management structure differently from American ones, because in case of European firms, they had experience of the risk and memory of such threat for during the entire post-war period. So their behavior was different, and their decision was different, and their priority was different. And in case of Roche, or I'm not sure about Nestle, but for example, in case of Roche, their capability to cope with political risk contributed greatly to their competitiveness during the war, and especially after the war. This is just an example, but I think it suggests many things.
Right. So it sounds like in some ways, partly what you're saying is, grasping these periods of economic nationalism helps us grasp aspects of organizational form we couldn't otherwise sort of understand, such as holding company structures, dual holding company structures, asset transferability, ability to kind of mask nationality and so forth. Matthias, you want to respond?
I think what is also an important point of what Takafumi said, and links back to what Stephanie said earlier, is there is also this issue of memory. This is not something that we shift. It's not a black and white story. We shift. Now it's global, and we forget about everything that was before. And because we are contingent, and these strict structures, they lingered for a long time. Okay, and sometimes they became vehicles for other things like tax havens and so on. So that's also important. And the same is for people. As I said, the Chinese haven't forgotten about the 19th century. They're taught in high school about it, and in a version that is very anti-British, anti-West. Ask somebody. I teach a very multinational audience where and you ask the people from the West, and nobody had heard of the Opium Wars. You ask somebody who's brought up in China, and that's part of the curriculum. And so these things they can also be used by whoever wants to use them. They're there, they linger, and they can resurrect it. And that's another thing where history comes in. History is not something that we wipe the sheet clean and we start from fresh. No, it's there is a long history behind everything we do, and there is collective memory, and there is structures, institutions that linger, and that's also very, very important to understand. I think that's very important for us research as well. The things that linger, the things that are sticky, the things that.
Because you can't explain the origins of organizational forms, of strategies,
unless
of practices without understanding those long-term sort of imprinting.
Yeah. So again, my example of China. Everybody says look at the press. They call China aggressive, at the worst, or at least assertive in terms of their foreign policy. But if you don't know where this is coming from, if you don't know the history behind this, this seems like strange. But if you know the history, it seems like a little less strange. Okay, so this is very, very important. And again, you see some organizational forms, you say, what's wrong with these people? And there's nothing wrong, because they have a history, and they linger and they stick, and that's why history is important for anything you do in global terms, global business terms, global politics terms.
Stephanie, do you want to add to that too?
Yeah. I think I'd like to pick up on the point that Matthias raised about the organizational forms, organizational structure and strategy, and how far this is actually influenced by history and by the type of multinational, for example, we're looking at. So there was this very influential book by Bartlett and Gershall about managing across borders, where he compared the structure of different multinationals in the 80s, and for me there was always this very interesting pairing in there of Unilever and Procter & Gamble. Were seen as the sort of two opposite multinational strategy structure solutions in the same industry. And if you know the history of those two multinationals, it's very clear where these different strategic approaches come from. So I worked a lot on Unilever, in particular on their subsidiaries in West Africa, but that was also true for India, for Latin America, where they also had subsidiaries. Unilever was an expert of dealing with political risk, was highly locally responsive, and was extremely good at managing the different nationalisms in different areas, and was actually extremely strong performance in those areas. But at the headquarter level, after a while, they were really outcompeted by Procter & Gamble, which were far more globally integrated. They transferred profits back to headquarters. They were in areas that were far more internationally open. So as a result, after a while, Unilever, even though very successful in its own approach, looked less successful as the rest of the world became more open, and they had a very strong presence, and very strong capabilities in parts of the world that were more economically nationalist. So, it wasn't that like Unilever did not understand what the problem behind that strategy was, but there was a very strong organizational memory. They had very strong capabilities in a certain area. And with the rise of emerging economies in the 2000s, there were some areas in the world where Unilever really leveraged that very successfully, like, for example, India, where I think they're still more successful than Procter & Gamble, and where Procter & Gamble had much bigger problems adapting to more unique cultural markets. So I think multinationals as well are kind of shaped by this environment, but they also shape the environment in return. And I think the way the strategy and structure builds over time is something that few companies want to abandon entirely, largely because, as we've discussed earlier, you never know where the world economy is going to go next, and some of these capabilities are very valuable in the right context.
Matisse, now you did have one other sort of quote that you wanted to bring up for this section of it. Would
well,
you like to?
I think I talked about it already,
Okay,
so we
so
don't have
just
to
skip
do it.
Okay.
I think it's more important to look forward than to look back.
Okay, so let's sort of talk a little bit about, in sort of as a final question before opening it up, kind of what kinds of research opportunities does, in some ways, this kind of moment create to kind of rethink both how we study firms and entrepreneurs, as well as how we use history to study them, given both the current context of economic nationalism and the kind of historical perspective that you guys have provided. Who would like to start? That's open to any of you. Sure.
Well, I guess one of the areas that I always found very interesting is to look at historical cases of corporate strategies throughout history and think about what kind of options and solutions have firms developed in the past. Largely because firms tend to not necessarily remember the various solutions that evolved over time. At some point these materials go in the archives, and then the wheel gets sort of reinvented. But given that obviously history never repeats itself, but certain trends seem to come and go, certain structures we see appear again and again, I think it's worthwhile to look at companies not just in terms of a cross-section, what are companies doing right now, what are the strategic options, but go back in time and actually see what are different situations in different periods of time, and see what sort of strategic solutions have firms come up with over time, and in how far are these similar, different to today. What does it tell us about the capacity for strategizing in different international contexts?
Yeah, I mean, picking up from that, I think it's very important that this business politics nexus needs to be better understood. Mm-hmm. And the past can help us a lot because we know what has happened. This what I think people call corporate political action. That's not new at all. That's, as I said, it's underpinning a lot of what happened in globalization, deglobalization. We can understand it better if we understand the patterns from the past. But I think the most important thing is, to me, and I said that already, is that we're building on a past where there's things are institutionalized. There's collective memory, and we need to bring that out in the open. And as researchers, we are capable of bringing that out, and as teachers, we are capable of bringing that out in the open. So as I said, people don't understand Chinese behavior. They seem it's strange, but if you understand the history of what happened in the 19th century to China, then you understand better today's behavior. Okay, and that's not only true for China. That's true for many things. Even in firms, that's true. Certain firms, think, oh, well, why can't they do what everybody else does? Well, because they have a history behind it, and if we understand that history, we understand their current behavior, and we can use it, in positive ways. Just like some politicians use history in negative ways, but we can also use that in positive ways. But the first step before we use it in any ways is better understand it and bring it out in the open. And as researchers, that's part of what our calling is, to bring things out in the open, not leave them hidden. And I believe in whatever discipline you take, history matters a lot. So I encourage you, if you not to be a history researcher, but to read even those like historical novels. This book that I talked about, the Ibis trilogy, is a great novel, very well historically researched. I mean, the guy's done a lot of historical research. It's still a novel, but that's a way of accessing it easily.
Yeah, I also think that the historical approach or perspective is quite important. And in addition, to pay enough attention to political phenomena, a political aspect of the phenomena can shed new lights on the business and economics, because non-market elements or political elements, of course, has impact on organizational behaviors and other elements. So, variety of issues which have been analyzed from the efficiency or productivity or competitiveness on the market can be reinterpreted as soon as we integrate such non-market elements or a need to respond to a non-market threat or chances. Then we can we can have maybe better understanding on the behavior of the organization.
Great. I will add one other kind of sort of thing to maybe prod or poke, going back to this question which you sort of recoiled from around moral economy, which says, you all sort of point to the political economy aspect of it, and I think Steffi actually gets at these issues of legitimacy and legitimization processes underlying the stability of the international economy, right? And I think that sort of speaks to some extent, the political processes at work, but also the ways in which these were justified and justifiable to the actors involved. And I think history can do a lot to sort of get at the sense of in what ways were economic relations justified. So moral economy in an analytic, not a normative sense, how was it seen as justifiable at a moment of time and not justifiable at other moments of time, that I think history can sort of help us get at. But that's sort of just one other angle. But let me open it up to the audience for sort of questions. Jennifer, do you want to start it off? Yeah, come on. Yeah, actually, because I think it is being videotaped. So if you wouldn't mind, come up. Please do not be intimidated. Do not hold back your questions because of that. You can speak from your seats, but if you wouldn't mind coming to the mic, that would be great.
So I just finished a case, a little bit of an infomercial on Bridges Ventures, and this is exactly what Laura Tyson and I were writing about, is the interesting effects of Brexit and the U.S. rise of what I originally said was nationalism. What was curious is that Bridges did a hard pushback on the word nationalism. We had to extrapolate completely from the case. We had to use terms popularism. And I think this probably goes back to history of World War II and what happened in Germany, that there's just a very strong reaction to the sense of nationalism and some of the negative implications. I was curious what you thought of that. And then secondly, they pointed me to a lot of data that shows that, you know, the effects of some of these disenfranchised it used to be the pensioners that didn't have jobs in Europe, in England. It's now people of working age that don't have jobs. They're not educated for the right jobs. They don't have the right jobs. Similarly, in the Rust Belt of the United States, right, we have this issue. You know, it's just curious what we can learn about this. I think you touched on the disproportionate wealth and changes in how wealth is shared amongst populations and what that does to politics and a lot of the things, you know, the move towards open trade, not open trade, et cetera. So all of that I'm curious about your thoughts. But my head's been deep in these topics. It's really been actually a lot of fun given a fun side of the politics. A lot of the politics isn't fun these days, but it's sort of been interesting to at least be researching it.
I mean, the point about using the term nationalism, particularly with Germans, I'm German-British, so most of my work is in English, but I have on occasion translated or written something in German, and I was writing about economic nationalism, and it was almost impossible to translate because that term nationalism has such a different collective memory association, so it is just incredibly difficult using that term, and I needed to sort of almost switch mentally to realize what does that actually sound like to a German, and it sounds terrible. So you can't really discuss it quite in the same way. I mean, there's the term Wirtschaftsnationalismus, but once you say, oh, they're nationalistisch, and there's just a lot of baggage from history, and it's I think that's something we haven't actually discussed, which is the role of language, which of course in internationalism, nationalism, it's all about language, as anybody knows, particularly in the UK when we look at Wales and Scotland, but in other areas as well. So I think that I like that point about the problem of translating as well, which we so easily forget because we're part of such an international community. We think it's just normal we all speak English.
But they were all over popularism. They thought that was appropriate. Popular vote, popular movements. So.
Yeah, which also I think has, populism has quite a negative connotation, but without that historical burden. Oddly enough, because it's just as much involved, but yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, no, language is crucial. I mean, that's very important to understand language and why. But it's only when you understand the history, then you understand why certain terms have certain connotations and why you have to be very careful with using them. But what I want to react to is this idea about the losers and the winners. And again, we have a very Western-centric view. Over the last 20 years, more people were lifted out of poverty in the world than ever before. We always forget that because we only look at those people who suffer, and rightly so. And the quote that I wanted to put up, and you don't have to put it up now, is when the founding fathers and the people who started this European integration movement, one of the things they said is, it is proposed that certain transitional measures should be instituted, such as the creation of a restructuring fund to facilitate the rationalization of production. And that's a European thing, and that's always been a European thing, and in some European countries more than in others, and in Britain certainly not, is that you realize there's losers, and you find ways of not compensating them, but helping them transition. And the Germans do that, the Swedish do that, because there is an awareness that, whatever change is happening, there won't always be 100% winners. And that's one thing in the US that is entirely left to the market. There is no, action with, or to the companies. And some companies, don't care, they just fire. And some companies do care and retrain people and find ways of re-employing them. But that's, I think, if you want to find a way to deal with, the losers, you have to find ways to bring them back on board. And that's not going to be easy. But you can't leave them on their own. And the Europeans kind of realize that. So if you actually do look at the German policies and the Swedish policies in that respect, but don't forget, this is a Western developed world problem. You go to Africa and people, or go India or China, people that will see opportunity in globalization, not loss. Okay, so we're talking about us and not about the rest of the world. So, but it is, and that was the visionary thing in the foundation of the European Union. They understood that, and it's been a bit lost in here, but that we have to go back to that to say we need to deal with those. We need to help those who are left behind because of globalization.
Well, and certainly elected politicians are attuned to that because they're trying to get elected in a very short
Yeah, but they
term
get elected with
timeframe.
just blaming it on the other, and that goes back to my first quote where you say, oh, it's the foreigners. Okay, it's an easy.
Right.
And one of the reasons that Brexit came about is because everything that was bad was blamed on the European Union and the bureaucrats in Brussels. And actually, there's fewer bureaucrats in Brussels than there were in Washington in 1850. Okay, today. Okay, there's fewer bureaucrats than it's that you create these figures, the foreigner. And the bureaucrats in Brussels that are easy to blame for everything. Yeah, instead of actually dealing with it. And when we have to go back to also having politicians that can explain complex phenomena in a complex way rather than just with half a sentence, a one-liner. And then Twitter is a problem there.
Yeah.
because it has
Think-
word limits. It has word limits,
a lot
and
of people think that.
complex problems exceed the word limits in Twitter.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.